We are in the middle of Os Dalid. We're in the middle of Os Dalid. And the last thing we've been speaking about is the fact that there are many ways that God runs the world and directs the world. One of the ways, the first way we spoke about, was the fact that there is a sense of ensuring that a person will get their reward or punishment in this world before they get to the next world. So this is part of judgment, part of justice. In other words, the classic example is the tzaddik, who is going to get all the reward. Hashem wants all of them to get all the reward in the next world. They've done some sins, they've committed some crimes, they've committed some sins, and therefore God is going to punish them in this world in order for them to enter the next world with a completely clean slate. That's more about judgment. That's more about justice. The last piece, the last approach, the last modality or method that Hashem runs the world is not about justice, but it's more about the fact that Hashem will enable or help, assist, and sometimes prevent a person from doing what they are trying to do. This is more the expense count approach. So we spoke about this as an approach to the Hayim Shemoah, right? That the Rambam says that if you do what's right, you're going to get all these good things, not as a reward, but rather as a way of enabling you to continue doing mitzvos. Now, it's not necessarily limited to helping you do mitzvos. It could be the opposite, and that's what we're going to elaborate on today. He says like this: it's possible that a person will merit, that God will decree that they'll have much success in this world to assist the person in their service of God. So that they'll be easy for the person to attain their perfection that they are seeking, and there'll be nothing in their way. So Hashem's going to go ahead and make life easy for the person so that they will continue to go ahead and do mitzvahs, not as a reward, but as a way of paying their expense accounts, enabling them to go ahead and do what they want to do. However, at the same time, not everyone necessarily gets an expense account, right? Depends where you are in the company. Sometimes they say, oh, you get an expense account. Sometimes we'll pay for your travel, and sometimes you don't get those benefits, right? In other words, there's also going to be a scenario where a person will not necessarily get that. Does that mean they are a worse person? No. There's a cheshbon, there's a calculation, and sometimes a person will not get that expense account, and sometimes God will decree the opposite, that Hashem is going to actually challenge the person more, and therefore will not give them an expense account, and will make it even more difficult for them, not as a punishment. The fact that these bad things the fact that these difficult things are happening to the person is not a punishment. It's that Hashem decided they don't get an expense account, and maybe for their purpose in life, Hashem wants them to, again, as we said, each person is a soldier in the army, and for them to do what they need to do, they're not going to get an expense account, and maybe Hashem will go, so to speak, to the opposite extreme, and make it difficult, because for their purpose in life, that needs to happen, and therefore they're not getting expenses, and sometimes Hashem will actually make it more difficult. Hashem will place walls, so to speak, between them and their perfection that they're seeking, to the point that they have to put so much more effort in order to attain, to break through that wall, and to strengthen themselves to overcome all their challenges to attain the perfection. So when a person sees difficulties happening to them, it's not necessarily going to be, again, a form of a punishment of any sort. Rather, this from the perspective of of their attempt to get to what they want to, Hashem could sometimes give them help and assistance, and sometimes actually do the opposite, not as a reward, not as a punishment, but as a way of paving the way or blocking the way forward. He says, you could have an evil person who Hashem will give them much success, to open the path for them to get destroyed. In other words, sometimes Hashem, not as a reward for their good deeds, but sometimes a rasha. Hashem says, yeah, you're a rasha, good, I'll help you, I'll give you an expense account also. You want to do evil? No problem, here you go. You could be a billionaire, great. And now you'll have all the things you want to do, and Hashem will help you do so. And there also could be cheshbonos, calculations, to prevent the rasha from everything that he wants to do. And there could be some reason that Hashem will prevent the rasha from accomplishing that they want to accomplish. So sometimes, for example, the rasha wants to do something bad, and really Hashem wants to enable the rasha to do it. The problem is, if he does what's bad, it's going to hurt a tzaddik, like David himself. David sometimes davens to Hashem, listen, don't let the rasha be successful. Now, from the rasha's perspective, Hashem really wants to help the rasha do what's wrong. The problem is, if he does what's wrong, it's going to hurt a tzaddik. And so again, there's so many, that's like a simplistic point, but the point is there's so many different factors over here. Okay, last paragraph to this piece. Amnam. He needs Baruch Shemo. I'm just going to summarize it because we're running out of time, but the point is like this. All that said, at the end of the day, after 120, person's going to stand before God, okay? One person, it was very easy for them to do mitzvos. One person was very difficult for them to do mitzvos. For whatever reason, right? For this expense account, so to speak, approach. The person who was easy to do mitzvos is going to be judged differently than the person who was hard to do mitzvos, right? In other words, there's one calculation here on earth and saying, okay, God decrees this person is going to be easier for them to do mitzvos because Hashem's helping them. Great. And that's a good benefit. And that means that person who is living a good life, it's not coming away from the reward. True. In other words, they're not getting rewarded in this world, Baruch Hashem, right? In other words, when a person, everything good that happens to you is not necessarily a reward. It could be Hashem's helping you do mitzvos. Great. It's not taking away from the reward. But when we go to the Olam HaEmes at 120, Hashem says, I made it really easy for you. Why don't you go crazy, right? And the person who had a very difficult life, right? It wasn't necessarily a punishment, a reward, but Hashem will see that person differently, judge that person differently, because they had to overcome so much more to do what's right, right? So there's always going to be justice, right? There's all these different factors happening, but don't think for a second, and that's why we have to constantly remind ourselves, this world is not everything. There's the next world. So why these things happen, one of, in this life, could be one of many reasons, but in the Olam HaEmes, Hashem is ultimately going to judge a person taking into account the type of life that was given to them in this world.